Saxophone Revisited, which was a column written by Dr. Paul Cohen, who's at the Manhattan School. And he had a picture. He was leaning over a table, right? And he had this picture. And on the picture, he had this instrument, kind of like, you know, he's leaning and you see this view, right? And he had this instrument as well, kind of like this. And then he had an F mezzo, and I thought, man, I want to have those someday. How in the heck am I going to do that? And so when you become 50, if you look from the time you're 12, by the time you're 50, maybe you'll find it. So I've just been interested in the thing forever. And I started to learn about the man who invented the instrument. And, you know, we talk about how it was an invented instrument. Like, you can see premature sack butts before there was the trombone. You can look at chalumeaus and mimics before you see, like, clarinets. You know, you look at bugles before you see trumpets. You know, you see these evolutions of an instrument. The saxophone, here it is, right? This says on it, you know, this is number 33,334, saxophone in Mi flat, Adolphe Sax, something Brevet, you know, number 50, Rue Saint George, Paris, right? So this is it. This is 150 years old. Mr. Sax's factory made this instrument. It doesn't look that different. It's not that different from our modern day instruments. And so, you know, there's some things that are old and kind of archaic, like they didn't have automatic register or octave keys. So you have two. At one point in the 19th century, there were four on certain models from different brands. And so, you know, the evolution is very short. It was invented. But was it really? Where did he get the idea to make the saxophone? It wasn't truly just, he didn't just come out of the sky and said, I'm going to make this thing and I'm going to name it after myself, right? It wasn't actually done that way. Does anyone have any knowledge of Mr. Sax? Well, let's talk about the man a little bit. He was the most unlucky individual in the history of the world, almost, except for maybe Job. But like, he was super unlucky, right? Does anyone know how many times he almost died before he got to adulthood? Anyone?
5.
7.
7. Yeah.
7 times. I think I can remember all 7. Let's see. So, at one point in his life, he fell in the river, and he was drug out of the river by a passerby in Dinant, Belgium. He was born in Dinant, Belgium. Okay, so he almost drowned in the river. He swallowed a needle. He drank muriatic acid because he thought it was milk. He fell down like 3 or 4 flights of stairs onto the cobblestone and knocked himself out. He was like unconscious for a week. A slate from a tall building in Dinant fell and hit him on the head as he walked by. Is that 5? He fell onto a burning stove and burnt like half of his body. And then he was blown across his father's workshop by a gunpowder explosion. All before he was an adult. So his father's name was Charles Joseph Sax, and they were in Belgium. Antoine Joseph Sax, or Adolphe Sax, was born in Dinant, Belgium. The reason he had a nickname, Adolphe, was because his grandfather was also Antoine Joseph Sax. So it's Antoine Joseph, Charles Joseph, Antoine Joseph. You know. So little Adolphe was super unlucky. His mother thought that he was cursed. And his mother called him the ghost child of Dinant, which is, you know, it's pretty bad luck, right? It's just pretty terrible. But his father was an instrument maker. His father was actually the royal instrument maker for the king of the lowlands. So, you know, the Netherlands and Holland and Belgium, they're all like below sea level. And so the king of the lowlands, Charles Joseph Sax, was the royal instrument maker. So Adolphe grew up around instrument making. Like, he grew up around making this kind of stuff. His father was a circuit player. He's a woodworker. And so Adolphe was a flutist first. So when he's very young, 5, 6 years old, he learned to play the flute, and then the clarinet. And in one of the books I read, it said by the time he was, 7 or 8, he could turn the body of a flute, and he could spin the cup of a brass instrument, or spin the cup of a horn. And I thought, oh, what does that mean? Spin the cup of a horn. Is that the mouthpiece? Is that the bell? Spin the cup. So he could make musical instruments. And he was a very fine player, even. Throughout his life, he was very cocky about his musical ability. He would challenge people to duels. If he thought you were full of crap and you couldn't play very well, he'd challenge you to a duel. And then you'd meet at dawn and play the horn, and yeah, you suck, go away. That kind of a thing. So he was a very fine player, and he was a very fine inventor. In those days, he was born in 1804, November 6th or 7th? 6th, 1804. And in those days, you had these grand expositions. You had these fairs, and you'd go and bring your products, and you'd be judged, right? So he'd bring his products, and he'd be judged. And when he was a teen, he entered in his instruments, flutes, clarinets, trumpets, no saxophone yet, into an expo, a fair in Belgium. And he was probably 18, 19 years old. And they gave him a silver medal. Now, his instruments were clearly the best, just clearly the best. And the judges gave him the silver. And in whatever, I can't remember what book I'm pulling all this stuff from, but he was really mad. He was really mad because he won. And the judges said that if we give you the gold now, what will we do next year? So they kind of made an excuse just wait, you're young, right? And he said to them, well, if I'm too young for the gold, I'm too old for the silver, and he left Belgium. And he went to Paris. Paris is a much bigger city, and he wanted to go, and he had some friends that were encouraging him to come. He had some real supporters that wanted him to come to Paris. A couple of his supporters, like Berlioz, was a supporter of Mr. Sax. In fact, Napoleon III, I think, was also a supporter of Sax, and so they wanted him to come. And he came to Paris, and he was an outsider. He was not Parisian. He wasn't French. He was Belgian. And so the other instrument makers really didn't like him. Really not at all. And he came and he started making instruments, and he got military contracts. And he could outfit a military band with 30% less people and all the same sound, right? So you have less people, but it was loud and it was proud, it was big, right? So you had these beautiful sounds coming out of it with less people. And the other instrument makers hated it. They actually started a group, the United Musical Instrument Makers, something, and they were really upset at Mr. Sax. And throughout his life, he moved several times, 6 or 7 times. The longest he was ever in a factory was number 50 Rue St. George, right there, which is where we get the name for our classical saxophone, the Rue St. George that Dr. Wheeler plays. And it's all based on that where this comes from, these historic places. So they really didn't like him. He was sued 30 times in his lifetime as an instrument maker. They just constantly were suing him for patents and things like that. And Mr. Sax patented everything. He wanted to make sure nobody could steal his ideas. And the saxophone was a patent. So the saxophone was invented when? Anyone know? The patent date? What? Yes?
1846?
Ooh. Is that 46? I thought it was just
Patent.
patent. Is it 46 or 41?
I think it's 46 when it was patented.
But there's 2 dates. March 21st, 1846? 41? Thank you.
Yeah.
1841, March 21st was when he applied. June 22nd, I think, is when it was approved. And so there's 2 dates that you'll find on the internet. It's oh no, this is the patent date. Oh no, this is the patent date. But I think it's applied and approved. It might be 1846. Look it up. I can't
I
remember.
believe it's 41. I think
Okay.
you're right.
Yeah. But I'm dyslexic, and sometimes it's bad. So he invented this thing in the 1840s, and he patented it. And you might be right, because it was expired in 66. I don't know. So anyway, in that time period. And so this thing was patented for that period of time, and all the other French makers couldn't make it. You can't make my saxophone. So if you want saxophones in military bands, tough. You gotta buy it from me, right? You can't buy it from my competitors. As soon as 1866 was done, did you see Dave's table out here? All his vintage stuff. He had a silver Yvette and Schaefer saxophone. It was made in the 1860s by Yvette and Schaefer. Looks just like that one. Like just like that. Because the patent was over. So what did they do? They got one and they made it. So, Mr. Sax's invention was coveted, I think, by all the French makers. And, oh gosh, we don't have any time. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to do this faster. So, and Mr. Sax had trouble throughout his entire life. He, in his 40s, he got cancer in his face. He had a tumor that grew so big he couldn't play the saxophone. He actually went to kind of Eastern medicine and was cured by the use of non-traditional medicine. He lived until he was, I think, 94 years old. He died in the late 19th century. And his son, Edward Sax, carried on the family business at Rumira, which actually Woody played a saxophone today that was made in that factory. And then they eventually sold the business to Henry Selmer. You've all heard that name, right? Like everyone's heard of that. And he was not a saxophone player; he was a clarinet player. But he and his brother Alexander built a beautiful business making clarinets, products, reeds, mouthpieces, then instruments, and then all kinds of instruments. There's been trumpets and trombones, oboes, English horns. Like they made a lot of stuff. Anyone heard of Louis Armstrong? He played a Selmer trumpet that had the valves a little further out, than normal trumpets. So Selmer was a great company, and they really took on the history of the saxophone. And so some of the things we'll talk about in the history of the evolution of the saxophone, we'll talk about Selmer because they bought the original factory and they kept it going. Now, the saxophone, born in Belgium, grew up in Paris. One last thing I should tell you. They hated Mr. Sax so bad there was an assassination attempt too. And they ended up killing his shop manager because his shop manager was closing the shop at number 50 Rue St. George, and it was dark. And the guy came up and shot him, and they thought they were getting Mr. Sax, but they got a shop manager instead. So this is how much these people hated Mr. Sax in Paris. So many lawsuits, many things. But when his patents expired, they started making his designs, and the first one, I think his name was Gautreaux, and he started making instruments. And he really didn't like Mr. Sax, so he created a new instrument called the sarrusophone. Anyone heard of that? Sarrusophone. So before the saxophone, I think he was influenced by another big metal instrument with holes and keys, but played with a brass mouthpiece. And it's called the Ophicleide. No, the Ophicleide? Ophicleide? Just kidding. It's a pretty awful instrument. You buzz into it like a brass instrument, and it's got keys. Yeah. It's kind of the evolution of the serpent, which his father played, right? And it's a big brass instrument, and you can play low notes on it. And he thought, what if I take a clarinet mouthpiece and stick it on that thing rather than this, trombone mouthpiece or tuba mouthpiece that's on there? So you don't buzz into it; you actually play a reed. And he's like, no, let's try it. So that is kind of where the saxophone invention came from. And the first saxophone was which one? Because it was a big family, right?
The bass.
Correct. Who said bass? Good job. What key was it?
B flat.
Nope. It was in C. So the original patent called for two families. So I brought my bass just so you could get a size reference of it. Oh, it's so unpleasant. So this is kind of the first saxophone. Now this one is in B flat, not C. I don't have a C bass saxophone. I don't know if there is one anymore. But the first saxophone was a bass instrument. It was for what purpose? Like, why invent something like this?
I'm guessing to give a bunch at the time. It was the romantic era at the time, so the orchestra were expanding.
Mm-hmm.
So they needed more of a bass
Mm-hmm. Right.
to support the reed.
Right? Yeah. It's kind of to give volume, projection, body, but with facility of a woodwind. right? So you could actually do more than oompa, right? Similarly, like bassoon was, these low reed instruments were really to augment the church, because not every church had an organ. So back in, the big bassoons, normal bassoons were like to give you a note, and then the choir could sing, right? You could chant. So because not every church had an organ, so that's why these low reeded instruments started coming about. And this was the first one. This was to add power, and you could play more than just whole notes and things like that. So the bass was the first one, and he invented or patented 2 families of instruments. Anyone know what they are? Don't all speak at once.
Bass clarinet?
Well, he did the bass clarinet.
The modern bass clarinet?
Yeah, we owe a lot to Mr. Sachs for the modern bass clarinet for sure, because he basically invented what we play on today. Before that, it was like really narrow bore. It was like a basset almost. It was hard to play. And he opened up the bore and made the bell and the whole thing. It makes it a lot bigger. But no, for the saxophone, there were 2 families of saxophones in the patent: a B flat, E flat, and C and F. And the idea was, we're going to play the B flat and the E flat instruments in the band, and we're going to play the F and the C instruments in the orchestra. But the orchestra never really caught on to the saxophone. It was never really added as a member of the saxophone. And the saxophone actually never became really popular until after Mr. Sachs died. Like, it wasn't what it was until it came to America. When the saxophone came to America, that's when the saxophone really became a world type of instrument. And the saxophone first came to America in 1853-ish, 1854, with a band that came from France and toured the country, played 200 concerts. I forget the guy's name, Jean something, but it came in that era, and it toured, and there were a saxophone section in there. But Patrick Gilmore heard that. Does anyone know that name? Patrick Gilmore? Any music history classes? Patrick Gilmore had the most popular concert band in the United States. He toured all over the United States. It preceded like the Sousa band. Like the Gilmore band was entertainment. Like you'd go to the concerts. It was amazing. And after the Civil War, he wanted to have this peace rally in Boston. And so in the late 1860s, he got this peace rally together, and he invited bands and orchestras and everything from all over, and they came to Boston to celebrate peace. Because America had just gone through a horrible experience with the Civil War, and he wanted to celebrate peace, and he brought the French Republican Guard band, and they had 5 saxophones, and they came and performed. Of course, the French Republican Guard band was where Henry Selmer played clarinet in his days as a performer, and with Selmer buying Sax's factory and making saxophones, obviously there would be saxophones in the French Republican Guard band, and they came, and Mr. Gilmore said, I like the sound of those things, I want those in my band, so he started arranging his repertoire for saxophones, and that's how he started bringing the saxophone to America. And then there was a very important gentleman whose name was Edward Lefebvre, I'm not French, so you'd have to excuse my lack of an accent. But Edward Abraham Lefebvre was the first saxophone soloist with the Gilmore Band. He was a Belgian. He moved to South Africa for a period of time. He knew Adolphe Sax. He had an instrument from him, like that one over there. And he came to the United States and played with the Gilmore Band, and he was known as the Saxophone King. You can actually look up these posters of the Saxophone King, E.A. Lefebvre, and he got a job working for C.G. Kahn. Has anyone heard of that name? C.G. Kahn. Charles Gerard Kahn. That's a whole nother talk that we can go into and talk about Mr. Kahn, Colonel Kahn. He was a senator. He was the mayor of Elkhart. He owned a printing press. He owned a rubber stamp company. He owned a bakery. He started the Kahn Band Instrument Company because somebody punched him in the face, and he split his lip, and he needed a mouthpiece that he could play on, and he owned a rubber stamp company, so he made a rubber trumpet mouthpiece, a cornet mouthpiece. That's the birth of the Kahn Company in 1873. And Edward Lefebvre was a consultant for Kahn. He was the artistic consultant. That's very important. So with Mr. Sachs, he was a player. He could play. he was his own artistic consultant. With Kahn, he was a trumpet player. He didn't play the saxophone. Mr. Lefebvre was the king of saxophone, and he worked for Kahn, and he was his artistic consultant. And he had his instruments from Europe. And so what they did, there were two guys, Edward Lefebvre, Charles Kahn, and a guy named Ferdinand August Bischer, or Gus. And Gus Bischer was the foreman at the Kahn Company. And in 1888, they made the first saxophone in America. Pretty big deal, right? And that's the first one ever. A friend of mine actually owns it. My friend Jake, he has number 1. It's a pretty cool horn. And that was the beginning of Kahn's intro into making saxophones, and eventually Kahn became the largest maker of saxophones in the world. In the 1920s, this roaring 20s, when those two horns were made, that horn was made, and a lot of my horns were made in the 20s, because that was the time of huge popularity for the saxophone, and everyone wanted to have one. And I think it was something like 75% of Kahn's production was saxophones. Now think about that. Like, they made everything: tubas, cornets, French horns, clarinets, flutes. They were the biggest band instrument company in the world. And 75% was saxophones? Like, this is a hugely popular instrument, right? And so they had this artistic director, being Edward Lefebvre, and they basically copied his instrument and made it in America. And then they just started making subtle improvements. So when we talk about this instrument, I showed you this, right? The C melody. This was important in the 20s because, I can't remember what I did before and what I'm doing now. This is pitched in the key of C. This is part of that F-C family. And this was, during the vaudeville era, this was a hugely important instrument because you could play at home, you could play in the parlor with your piano. There were no TVs, there was no Netflix in the 1920s, no video games, no iPads, not even radio in the beginning, I don't think. So this was your entertainment. So you'd have a piano, you'd have your C melody saxophone, and you could play at home. Kahn was making all kinds of saxophones because they were just throwing everything at the wall. Like, what can we do? What can we do? And then they made this weird thing called the Kahn O sax, and it's essentially an F mezzo soprano saxophone without the bend. And the ads in the 20s, it's like, for those interested in something new, and I think it said something like, plays like a saxophone, sounds like an English horn, and looks like a heckelphone. Right? Does anyone know what a heckelphone is? Well, heckelphone's a weird bass oboe instrument made by Heckel in Germany. But this was something new, right? This was something never done before. And in the 20s, this was double the price of an alto. So your alto was like $200. This was like $400. This was really expensive. And they made them in 1928, and they made them in 1929, up until about October 13th, 1929. Any ideas why they stopped?
Too expensive?
Who said it?
Too expensive?
Nope.
Great Depression.
There you go. The Great Depression, the crash, that's the day. No one was spending double the amount on an instrument for a saxophone in F, first of all. So this became a relic real fast. And they basically stopped making them, and so there's only 27, I guess, left on Earth. This is one of those instruments. It's the most rare, except for a Loomis saxophone, there's only 6 of those. But this is very interesting. So this is the amazing Kahn sax. Next to my straight alto, again, it was the 20s. Let's make something weird, because we make all the normal saxophones. And so this is a straight alto in E flat. Again, just because everyone wanted a saxophone, and if you already had one, what else am I going to sell you? So the companies were like thinking of all these things to do and all that stuff. And eventually, 30s, the Great Depression, we got into the swing era, we got into the big band era, We got into the 40s with Glenn Miller and all, like we had kind of shaped the musical ensemble of the United States. And FC was not going to make it. Like, no one bought C melodies anymore. No one, goodness, there's no F saxophones for goodness sakes. And then we start into like regular saxophones, right? So this saxophone is Selmer saxophone. This is called a balanced action. This was developed by Selmer after its first 3 models that came out in the 1920s. This one is from 1935, so this is a first-year production. When I was in junior high, this was my teacher's. It sat on the stand when I went for lessons every week. And so it's kind of special to me, but also it's like the first-year production of the balanced action. And this is super cool because before this instrument, we had these instruments, right? And can somebody tell me what the biggest difference they see? Huh?
The red keys.
Right, the bell keys, right? Right. So the bell keys, you had weird bell keys. And it didn't feel comfortable. And it wasn't very ergonomic to your fingers. And somebody said the other day, the biggest difficulty with like designing a saxophone is what do you do with the left pinky? And it's a challenge, right? So this was the solution. This balanced action balanced the action for your pinky. And it felt good, and it was comfortable, and you could get around, and you'd have more facility in it. And it was awesome, right? And so this is an important saxophone in the history of the saxophone. But I think the next one is truly the most important instrument in the history of the saxophone. This is called the super action. A lot of people call it the super balanced action. Some are always called it super action. So first we balanced the action, and then we made it super. And so balancing the action made the left pinky kind of feel right? Bell keys on this side, on the right side. What was super? What happened to the super that's different from the balanced? Anyone got it? Who said it? No? So what happened is we rotated the right hand this way. Before that, all the tone holes were in a straight line down the horn, and you played it like this. No. But then we made it super, and we brought this hand this direction. And this, I think, is the most important instrument in the history of the saxophone because it laid the foundation. Every saxophone made since uses this layout. You can add a roller here, you can add a thing here, you can change this or that, but essentially, this horn laid the foundation. This paved the way for all the other horns to come. So then what happened after the super action? Selmer was in their stride, and they were doing awesome work, and they were making cool saxophones, and all the cool cats were playing them, right? Everyone was playing them. They would put out ads saying, if you've heard these people, you've heard a Selmer saxophone. They tried Selmer. You'll sound better on a Selmer. These are all like ads from them. And so then they made the Mark 6. My Mark 6 is odd. Can anyone tell me why my Mark 6 is odd? It goes to low A. Yeah. Super weird, right? The bell is way high. So again, this is my high school and college teachers. And when he passed away, I had it restored. And this is a cool saxophone to me because low A, that's just cool, right? A lot of people didn't like the low A saxophone because it's really dense sounding. It's got a darkness to it. And it doesn't, no jazzers played it, except for one who can name the jazz player who played on a low A alto saxophone. Anyone?
Ornette?
Yes, thank you! Ornette Coleman. He played on a Mark 6 in white lacquer. White lacquer, beautiful saxophone. So we go through all, so Selmer had its progression and to the Mark 6. I don't have a Mark 7 because I don't really like them. But I do have this because this was my first pro horn. I was like 15 years old. My dad took me to a music store and he's like, we're going to get you a pro saxophone. And it was a Series 2 Selmer. It was a super action. Not this super action. but this super action in the 1990s. And this is a super action 80 series 2 from like 1995. So I just graduated from high school. This wasn't the one my dad bought me. Sadly, I would sell things my whole life. And so I buy and sell crap all the time. So I sold it as a dumb kid. And, but I wanted one from that era. I wanted the same type of instrument, the same engraving, the same feel. So this is that. Now, what's the most popular Selmer saxophone ever? It's the Mark VI, right? Totally. They made 180,000 of them, ish. They've made like 500,000 of these. So the Series 2 is actually the most prolific saxophone that Selmer has ever made, which is why I have one as an example. So the Americas, we really started to popularize the saxophone, but then Selmer came along and said, we're going to make it better than everyone else. Maybe. There's another company, well, Kahn said maybe. I'll talk about this one first. So this is, I think, the best example of the Kahn through history. This one is also from the 1930s. And I like to get something like the best example of every company, right? And this is called the Kahn Conqueror, with 2 N's. Kahn always played on words, always. There was the Constellation. If you went to go and learn how to repair instruments, you would go to the Convocation School. They loved the word Kahn. And, but this is a Kahn 26M. This is the Conqueror model. This had rolled tone holes, had silver key touches, really cool. But look where the bell keys are. Wait a minute, 35, wait. We had the balanced action in 1935. This is the 30s. They didn't, what, huh? They weren't quite caught up, right? They didn't quite catch on. They did everything to try to make it feel good. They added, like, the B-flat key was sweeping, went all around so you could kind of feel the same, but it didn't feel the same. The G-sharp didn't rotate, it went straight back. Like, it felt different. So the American company is like, we're going to make an awesome saxophone, and it is. It sounds so good. It's not comfortable. They had the micro tuner. You'd put your mouthpiece all the way on, and then you would just micro tune it. You could screw it in and out. So cool, right? It's cool. It's a neat saxophone. It sounds fantastic. But this is the 1930s, and that's the 1930s. Which one are you buying? This one. So there's another American company in Ohio called the H.N. White Company, excuse me, and the King saxophones, King band instruments. Well, wait a second. Oh, look, that's on the right side, isn't it? Look at that. That's so cool. Except these are not. So they started to. They put the tone holes on the right side, but again, this has some interesting mechanism, and but it's more comfortable. I was telling somebody earlier that this might be my favorite saxophone that I own. I love the engraving on it. This is all done by hand in Ohio. I love that it's all engraved on the keys. This saxophone has brazed tone holes, which means when you make a saxophone and you draw a tone hole out, like they did back then, well actually, these are soldered down tone holes. So they would put a hole in there, and then they would put a chimney on, and they'd solder it on the body. And then this guy in Boston invented a way to draw metal out of the saxophone and create a chimney through drawing the metal, called a drawn tone hole rather than a soldered tone hole. The guy's name was William Haynes, and he had a flute company. I think flutes, they draw the tone holes. We own the Haynes Flute Company. So it's really cool that Haynes is part of Eastman. And if you look at every Kahn saxophone, every single one, from like 1914 on to like 1930, 1920, 1930, I'll pass this around, you can see the back of it. Wait, that's a good shirt. Wait, wrong brand. Wrong brand. You need a Kahn. So Kahn, so look on the back here, it'll say, December 8th, 1914, 1119954. That's the patent number, 1119954. You know how many times when I was in music retail, a guy would call me and say, I have a saxophone that was made in 1914. I'm like, no, you don't. Because you don't. Because that's the patent number. Those saxophones were made from 14 to 28, 30, like I said. But they had to put the patent number on there because they were using a patented process of drawing that tone hole that Mr. Haynes, William Sherman Haynes, patented in Boston, Massachusetts on December 8th, 1914, which is why it's printed on all these old Conn saxophones. And so anyway, like our company, we did the patent in 1914. It's pretty cool. And it's on all these saxophones, which I really love. This saxophone, however, did not draw the tone holes. This saxophone brazed the tone holes on. So they cut the hole in the body, they put a chimney on there, and then they silver soldered it, basically. And it's so good. Nobody does this anymore. No modern saxophone can do this. Technology to do this is super hard because when you do this with silver solder, it heats it up so much it kind of warps. There's so much, like it's a problem. We can't figure out how to do it yet. But it's super awesome, and this thing plays. You can see how thick the tone holes are because you didn't draw the metal. When you draw the metal, you thin it by half. It's so thick you could actually put the guards on the tone holes. So you see how the guards are soldered to the tone hole and not the body. Just little touches like that. And then the craftsmanship back then, full pearls everywhere, had pearl touches, engraving on all the keys everywhere. So the King Zephyr Special, this was 1937. This is, I think, the first year of production as well for the Zephyr Special. This is the father to the King Super 20. So this is like the Super 20 before there was a Super 20. And they had sterling silver necks with gold lacquer. A lot of people think they were gold plated, but they were gold lacquered. And so when you see the lacquer wearing off, you'll see the sterling silver underneath, but it's a gold lacquer on that saxophone. So the Americans were trying really hard to keep up with the French. But all the saxophones we play today look like these and not like these. So there was, I think the battle was a tough fought one, but it was ultimately lost because they didn't feel as comfortable as what the French were coming up with. So as you look at the American saxophones, the last professional American-made saxophone, really, 1950s. Well, the last one was really the King Super 20. But I don't have a King Super 20. So my latest, the one that's the last in my collection, is the Bisher Top Hat and Cane. And this was made in 1950. And the 50s, that was kind of the end of the road, I think the Super 20 was made for another 10 or 15 years, maybe. I don't remember exactly. But really, that was it. Bisher was sold to Selmer USA, because there was a Selmer USA and a Selmer France. So this company was absorbed by Selmer USA in 1963. And this instrument, right here, the Bisher 400, became the Bundy saxophones of my youth. Right? This became the student model. So this was, Johnny Hodges played this one, right? But this became the student model because it was old-fashioned technology. It wasn't the new, latest, and greatest thing. So the French really became like the makers of saxophones. Saxophone after America, there were other places in the world that started making saxophones. Taiwan, big one, and Japan, another big one. Which one was first? Taiwan or Japan? Who?
Japan.
Nope.
Taiwan.
Yep.
LC.
Yep, exactly. LC was the first in 1945. We're talking World War II era. They started making saxophones back then. Japan didn't make saxophones until the 50s. Who made saxophones first in Japan?
Yamaha.
Nope.
Yamaha.
Yeah. So this is my Yanagisawa. I bought this horn at the factory, actually, not in Japan, in Wisconsin, where they import them and they set them up and distribute them. This one is their sterling silver model. So from the beginning, we've been making horns out of brass, and we've been either silver plating them or gold plating them or lacquering them or whatnot. But this one is solid silver, kind of like a flute. And it has such a different tonality and sound, I just fell in love with it. The other part of it is I met a person named Mel Martin. Has anyone heard of the name Mel Martin? Yeah, and he's awesome. He played with Benny Carter, and we became like, love Mel. He came out to my music store, and we did a couple of events together, and we talked about saxophones, and he sounded so great, man. On his curved soprano and his tenor, he used
to have a Selmer Super. I played on that one.
Yeah, but he started to sing the praises of this brand, and he played it for the rest of his life. And at the NAMM show, do you know what that show is? The National Association of Music Merchants. When we had started coming up with our own saxophones, Mel came by the booth, and he, hey Ryan, how you doing? Hey Mel, how's things going? He's like, I said, have you tried my horn? He's like, yeah. And he's like, I said, it's very good. I said, you think you'd leave Yanni horn? He's like, well, if there was one on my doorstep, I'd probably take it inside. That's exactly what he said to me. He didn't say he would, but if one was left on his doorstep, he probably would take it inside. So we had, the Japanese, first Yanagisawa, and they were a custom shop. They were a repair shop first. And in 1950s Japan, that was occupied Japan, right? So we had won the war, 1945. American Army, Navy, Air Force, there was a huge military presence in Japan in the 1950s, which meant there were military bands. And from World War II with Glenn Miller and the formation of the big band, the dance band, there were a lot of dance bands in the military in Japan. And the Yanagisawa, they would make your horn work right, and they'd fix it. So I see a lot more King influence in a Yanagisawa than I do like a Selmer influence or a European influence, because I think of that connection before they made them. And one horn that I didn't bring, but I have a quinnon as well, which is another French instrument. It's like a competitor to Selmer. They never really, but there's a few makers in France. Buffet was another one. They were one of the first to make saxophones after the patent. Yvette and Schaefer, which later Buffet bought. There's lots of buying and selling in the music business, right? You're buying companies and they go bankrupt and stuff like that. But you had the Japanese, you had the Taiwanese. The Taiwanese were like isolated. No one really saw Taiwanese saxophones until about the 90s. And then we started seeing a whole bunch of Taiwanese saxophones come to America because trade became easier, but the Japanese saxophones became super big, right? And with Yamaha, which is now the largest band instrument company in the world, they started making saxophones in 1969. So does anyone have a Yamaha? And on the bell it says, established in where? It says it on every one of them.
1887?
That's correct. They did not make saxophones in 1887. Just want to be clear. They didn't make saxophones until 1969. They didn't make band instruments until 1967. They made a trumpet first and then a saxophone second. And so they hired a guy named Reynolds Schilke to help them make trumpets. And they hired a guy named Eugene Rousseau to help them develop saxophones. So let's go back to the Kahn Company real quick. Who was their artistic director? Who was their counsel?
King of saxophone.
The king of saxophones, Edward Lefevre, right? Edward Abraham Lefevre. Yamaha gets in the business, they're smart. They're like, okay, we make pianos. We make organs. We're trying to make a trumpet, and Mr. Schilke is helping us. We're gonna make saxophones. We don't know anything about saxophones. So let's hire someone who does, right? So they got Dr. Rousseau, who is a beautiful man. And he was a Leblanc artist, I think before. But he played everything. I saw some of his collection when he decided to sell his instruments in Minnesota. I saw a lot of his instruments before they were purchased, and he had some of everything. I aspire to be like him. I'm working on it. It's not as big. But he had some of everything, and he had Selmers, he had LeBlancs, he had a whole bunch of stuff. But he went to work for Yamaha as an artistic consultant. Like, he was going to help them. He developed the 62. Like we have this relationship between a maker and a player. Go back 100 years. There was a relationship between a maker and a player. Go back to the beginning. The maker was the player, right? And there's always been this. When we talk about Fisher, right? So Gus Fisher made the first cod saxophone. He left and made his own company in 1893. That's not that far after 1888, right? It's like, I'm done with you guys. I'm going to go over here and do this my own thing. And he created saxophones. And who's his major artistic consultant? He was an immigrant from Germany. That's right, Theodor Rascher. And Rascher was like the head of the German classical school, right? Marcel Muehl. Who's Marcel Muehl? You heard of him? He was an artistic consultant too for what? This one over here, right? And he was a quinot player, and then he was a Selmer player, and he helped develop the Selmers. So this relationship between maker and player, super important, right? So throughout history, you see how these instruments were made by players who helped them develop them. What am I missing? Oh! This is an instrument, very odd. This is a LeBlanc system alto saxophone. This instrument was made by the G. LeBlanc Corporation in the 1960s. It doesn't play like a normal saxophone. It was their idea on how to make a saxophone more acoustically perfect. And it's really cool horn. It's super awesome. But what I love about this horn more than anything is who owned it. So we talked about Sigurd Rascher. He was like the head of the German school, right? And then Marcel Muehl is kind of the head of the French school. Well, there was a leader in the American school of saxophone player, and his name was Cecil Leeson. And Cecil Leeson, there's very few recordings of him. He was really early in the 20th century. He played a Martin saxophone. And in the 1960s, the Martin Company was purchased by the G. LeBlanc Corporation in Wisconsin. And the president of LeBlanc was a guy named Vito Pascucci. And the owner of LeBlanc in France was Leon LeBlanc. And so during the 60s, they wanted all these artists to you should play on my horn. Here, Mr. Professor, we're going to give you this gift of an instrument. Woody Herman got a gift. Johnny Hodges got a gift. Like all these prominent saxophonists got a gift. And this one was given to Cecil Leeson. Because he played a Martin. And now you play on a LeBlanc, basically, because LeBlanc owned Martin. But I don't think he ever really played this, because this is his horn. There's one little ding right there. So I think it was a lovely gift to Mr. Leeson, but I don't think he ever really played it, but he owned it. And I just think that's really cool. And I think that I'm in the business of making saxophones as well. And so the fact that Vito Pascucci gave this to Mr. Leeson, I'm like, oh, that's like musical instrument industry awesomeness right there. So this is a very special horn in the collection, but it's a very different horn in the collection as well. We're right at time. So one of the things I just want to kind of point out is through the history of the saxophone, there's always been a company that's been wanting to progress and make things different, make things better. And this is our latest attempt right here at making the next level, the next generation of the saxophone. This is our new 800 series 52nd Street alto saxophone. We did the tenor a few years ago. You've heard it many times with your teacher. But this is the latest. So from 1846 to 2024, that's kind of the evolution of the horn. And this instrument was developed, so the tenor was first developed with one of our artists. His name was Bob Mincer. He's awesome. He plays so good. And we worked on the horn for several years and developed it into what it is. And then we wanted to do the alto. And so I went to our artist roster and we approached Alex Hahn, who he's a fantastic player. I mean, a Grammy, teaches at USC, won the Monk competition, won the Brecker competition, won the Mincer competition, just you name it. If he entered a competition, he's won it, you know. And so now that he's teaching full time in Los Angeles, and now that he plays lead alto with Michael Bublé, and he teaches at USC, I'm like, can you help me develop this one? And he was gracious enough, and so we've been working on this one for a little while, and it's pretty much ready. We're really there. So Alex is going to play the last run of Prototype Next that I have, and we're going to say, yeah, we're good to go. So that's, again, working with an artist to make an instrument. But it doesn't just stop there. I feel like with our company, I want to make sure that all of our artists have a say. So I listen to every single artist that comes on board and plays our instruments, and it can be something as subtle as, I'd like this key to be moved here. Or I'd like, it kind of feels funny here, can you do something with that? And sometimes I have to translate what they say into metal. Like how can I accomplish, this note's a little thin, how can I make it more, not so thin? This doesn't play as easily, how can I make it play easily? So we look at the instrument and we make these little tiny subtle changes throughout the evolution of the line, because I don't think an instrument is ever done. So we work on it all the time. But we have some main artists that help us along the way. So that's an hour. So thank you. Is there any questions? Yes, just shout it out.
How did the saxophone get introduced to jazz?
Ooh, Sidney Bechet.
Really?
Yeah, he was a clarinet player in New Orleans, and the saxophone was not very popular. And there was a soprano saxophone, and he played clarinet. And I don't remember how he got hooked up with it, but he basically started playing soprano saxophone in the ragtime and Dixieland type ensembles that he was playing in, and it started like, hey, that's loud. You know, that sounds really cool. Let's start using more saxophone. So Sidney Bechet, I think, was the first artist to actually bring saxophone to jazz. The professors should correct me if they know I'm wrong.
No, I think
That's right.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the saxophone was used in vaudeville.
Yeah.
You know, there's that kind of crossover. You had early saxophonists like Frankie Trumbauer, who played with Fitz Blatterbeck, played
Right.
some melody saxophone.
Right.
But Bechet was really like the first serious
Jazz.
soloist,
Yeah.
and he was the most influential soloist in jazz before Louis Armstrong. So he kind of made jazz into this soloist art that it became early on. So Bechet is very important.
Yes, that's how. Any other questions? Yes? I forgot to take this out. This is inspired by Sigurd Rascher. This is an overtone saxophone. The model is the EAS OVTN. So Eastman overtone. Keyless, keyless saxophone. So you can practice your low B flat. Right? Did I didn't open everything. So this is my Barry from the 20s. It's a low B flat horn. I love it. I love low B flat Barrys. So I decided I wanted to make a low B flat Barry, even though nobody buys low B flat Barrys anymore. I thought, oh, we should though. These are awesome. So I got a hacksaw out, literally, and I took one of our Barrys and I cut the middle section out of the bell and I moved it down. So there it is. You can't even see the cut marks. No, I'm just kidding. This is not the one I cut. This is the modern interpretation of low B flat Barry from early on.
Would y'all sell B-flat berries?
Yes, this will be available for sale
Awesome.
in the future.
Is that a state prototype?
This is my personal one. The factory manager, as we were making them, and I was in China at the factory, and he was listening to me play. He saw my face light up, and he's like, "You really like that horn?" I said, "Yeah." I got giddy like a schoolboy, and he's like, "I'm gonna give it to you." So that was a gift from our factory manager. So really, really cool horn. Very cool horn. Yeah. So that eventually we will do that. Yeah. Any other questions about anything? Mr. Sachs? The Con Company?
Well,
Yeah.
what is one reason why the bass sax never caught on? It's just too big.
It's too big. It's super heavy. It's hard to carry around. They made a contrabass, right? Around the turn of the century. Has anyone ever listened to the Nuclear Whales? No. Oh, yeah. See, the Nuclear Whales. It's a saxophone ensemble, and they have a contrabass to soprano. They're a pain in the butt. They're hard to move. They're hard to live with. They're hard to play. They're hard to blow. The Bisher is the biggest of them all. I also own a Noble bass saxophone. Just a little, it's wrapped so differently. Plays the same pitches, but the size, because it's wrapped so differently, is like the same, it's like just slightly bigger than a baritone. It plays different too, but I bring this one because it's like, it's the big one, right? Has anyone ever watched Looney Tunes? Like the old original, like that's where I learned classical music, every Saturday morning. And the guy who played the bass sax parts had a Bisher. Like that's the sound that we hear when we're watching Bugs Bunny. And I've played his horn actually. A friend of mine in Los Angeles owns it. He's a bassoonist and a conductor, and he's got this bass sax that belonged to that gentleman, and it's super rad. This one also belonged to my teacher. So, there's a lot of history of my life wrapped up in these horns, my education. And my teacher in high school was also a repair technician. So a lot of your school horn doesn't work, I'll come down to the shop and, we'll fix it. And I would just watch him in awe. And a lot of my interest in how a horn works comes from, having a school horn in high school and having him fix it. And so that was his as well, and along with that, Barry. This was his first repair job, actually. He was 17 years old, and this guy brought it in. It was just black. The silver had tarnished, and this was his first repair job, and he fixed it all up for the guy, and then he never came back for it. And so this became his Barry, and I started to learn Barry on this horn before I could get my own. So I was in the school musical, I had to learn Barry, and so he lent me this horn to start practicing and learning to play Barry. And my dad found me a King Zephyr, 1956 King Zephyr. We bought it for $2,000. And then when we got it, we had to fix it, right? So my teacher again helped me kind of restore this 1956 King Zephyr, which a friend of mine in college still owns. Actually, I know where that horn is, and she gave it to her dad. I've told him if he ever sells it, I'm the first call, because I want that horn back. But this horn, I learned to play on this horn, Barry, and and then when he passed away, I took it to my friend Brian Whitaker in Long Beach, and he totally restored it. So this thing plays. What would he play today?
That's great.
This thing plays amazing, and it's 1927. So cool horn. B flat horn though, you can't. There's not a lot of low B flat Barrys made in the world anymore.